Hi, my name is Collin Ma, and I'm an undergraduate student at UT studying mechanical engineering. I'm also part of the Texas Rocket Engineering Lab as one of the engineering directors. So currently you're watching the inaugural Space Expert interview episode of the Strauss Center's Space Security and Safety Program. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Ruth Stilwell, Executive Director of Aerospace Policy Solutions, LLC, adjunct faculty at Norwich University, and one of the world's leading authorities on integrated space and aviation policy and governance. Dr. Stilwell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Yeah, so let's get right into it. So one of your many roles as executive director of Aerospace Policy Solutions, LLC. Can you tell us a bit about your organization?
Yeah, it's a very small consulting firm, and we bring in people as necessary for different topics. Primarily, um, it starts with a body of research and identifying different areas. It started as just me, and a lot of the times it's still just me. That's how the world of consulting works a lot of times. And what we discovered early on is there was a gap in the research knowledge. And that was the integration of aviation and space policy. We started on the launch side. My background was started in air traffic control 30 years ago, and I worked the airspace that the NASA launches occurred through. And what I noticed as I was working is it was tremendously disruptive to launch a rocket, disruptive to aviation. And when space was a government operation run by government entities or behalf of governments, the issue of priority is very clear. The government has priority. We can close the airspace, open the airspace, and the aviation industry has to just accommodate our priority. But as the commercialization of space really took off in the late 2010, I would say, when we started to see more and more purely commercial operations rather than a commercial launch on behalf of the government. That question of priority changed because then you have a commercial entity imposing a cost on another commercial entity. And it's the job of the government to balance that and determine where the priority lies, but it needs to be based on something. It can't just be on historically, space got that priority because that was attached to the fact that it was a government operation. So I started doing research and publishing in this particular question, this question of policy and priority. And from there, it expanded into a lot of other things, and then into space traffic management, which in its early days, when we talked about space traffic management, and when we say early days, we don't talk about 50 years ago, we talk about 3 years ago. But space traffic management was thought of in terms of air traffic management for space. So that's where I was able to take my aviation experience and bring it into the space community because it's a very different environment and a different domain. So that's kind of the big picture of what my consulting firm does. And as I said, depending on the issue is when we'll bring in other people. But it's a very small operation that's publishing and identifying problems is the key to moving that work forward.
No, that's great to hear. I think that as you know, especially with this boom in new space, that your firm will definitely become very, very useful for all of these new companies. Um, Great. So let's see. What led you to become an expert in space policy in the first place? As opposed to something like direct engineering, which is what I'm sort of on the career track for, or maybe as opposed to other public policy issues.
So that's actually an interesting path because I started in operational air traffic control, which is a very technical field, and then continued my education. And when I decided to get my master's degree, I chose public administration because I was interested in governments and how governments work and how we move forward as a nation. And I was also very, very active in politics within my labor union as an air traffic controller. So, how legislation is developed, designed, how needs are identified. And I became particularly obsessed with problem definition. That I saw so many times people would jump to the solution stage without fully examining the problem that they're trying to solve. And this is the path to have a mismatch between problem and solution, is to not spend the time defining what the problem really is. I did a lot of work in the financing side. In the mid 1990s, there was a global movement in air traffic control to change the funding structures from either fully government funded or excise tax funded to user fee funded. And what did that mean? And what that meant to me was that you now have subject your infrastructure to the fluctuations of an industry that has tremendous economic fluctuations. So what are the risks of this disconnect between what it means to be a public service infrastructure and what it means to be a commercial activity that's responsive to the needs? So the first big study I did, well, the first small study I did was on predicting air traffic controller retirements and how to meet that public need. But the second was on understanding all these different economic models for air traffic control. Once you start studying economic models, you are a policy person. You are no longer in technical fields because funding is fundamentally a policy question. And when you talk about funding, you're talking about priorities and government priorities. There's a very familiar saying: if you want to know a country's real priorities, look at their budget. So it doesn't really matter what leaders say, it's where the money is spent. And that is a definition of your priorities. So that work gets to this question of airspace priority, because one of the pressures to create user-funded air traffic control systems is to give the users more control over where the investment is made and where they can improve their costs. That at the same time was being focused on shorter routes, more direct routes. Well, if you're closing a big chunk of airspace to launch a rocket, you're interfering, you're coming into direct conflict with that question of shorter routes, more direct routes, and timing choice. So it just all naturally came together in these being very interesting questions. So what got me into policy is I think policy is fascinating. You get these very interesting, complex questions that it's never one line. There's always all of these forks and rabbit holes that you have to run down when addressing policy questions. And the risk of unintended consequences of poor policy is very, very high. So that really is what brought me down that path. And I still love the field of policy. As you can tell by the way I'm talking about it, excites me. It's very interesting. It's very challenging. And I think in the same way that engineers want to solve a particular problem, I see it the same way. But my particular problem involves legislation, policy, people, economics, rather than hard science.
No, yeah, that's super interesting. Actually, right now I'm taking the business and public policy certificate here at UT. I think like as an engineer, I didn't realize until I was getting into it, just like how complex and how it's like very, very interesting these problems are. Like as far as how like a government prioritize how companies interact with the government and rules and regulation there. So no, I definitely understand what you're saying there. Great. So you mentioned before that you started off as an air traffic controller. Can you give us some background on like the early, middle, and maybe your current stages of your career, and how do you determine or prioritize your career goals at each step along the way?
Oh, that was also very interesting. So I started in air traffic control in 1990. I am retired from air traffic control, but my career had a circuitous path that stayed with air traffic control being the base until I retired. And that's when I was able to make that transition into space. But there's still a big connection there because there are a lot of similarities and there's a lot that the space community can learn from aviation. And where I found the niche, which truly allowed me to launch my company, is that there were very few people that were knowledgeable in both fields. There's an intellectual knowledge of what the space community is or what the aviation community is, but that depth of how the processes actually work and decisions are actually made, there just weren't a lot of people there. And I met just a couple, one at McGill, where we were talking about the same thing, and we'd go to the space conferences, and it was quite lonely actually, because we were focusing on these minutiae of the policy, and particularly in new space, the technology was such a driver. That was where the excitement and focus was, but we still had our piece. And the good news is people started to pay attention and being able to bring those areas together. So in terms of my career path, I started as an air traffic controller. I loved air traffic control every day that I did it, including the last one. But once I was there, you're engaged in a process where there's big issues and challenges. And some of the big challenges that were early in my career, and I was very fortunate with the timing, is the modernization of air traffic control technologies and how we can automate more and more features, where that struggle is between the human provider and the machine, and how we work through those issues to get to the right answer, and the engagement of human in the loop of new technologies. So there was that. There was a push for a complete change into a free flight model, which was engineering driven, which was also very interesting. And then at the same time, this change in financing was happening. So I went back to school. While I was still in air traffic controller, I got my master's and then my doctorate in public administration. And once you start researching and writing, it's addictive, right? You want to share your knowledge with the world, and the things that you've learned along the way, so that people don't make decisions without that full information. It doesn't do any good for me to have like a lot of things in my head. How do you get it out into the world? And that was through presenting, writing, and publishing. So then I had the opportunity to serve as the industry expert on air traffic control on the Air Navigation Commission at the UN Specialized Agency for Aviation, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And the Air Navigation Commission is the technical body through which all global standards for aviation go. So it was the process of developing global consensus, global implementation of new standards, implementing new technologies, and also new techniques to increase the capacity. So airspace is a finite resource. How do you increase the capacity? And that is through the technology. How do we get more precision? How do we get more precision on where the aircraft are, more precision about where they're going to be? And when you start talking about that, if you're in the space community, that immediately takes you to space traffic management. How do we make the orbital domain sustainable and allow for more and more activity there?
So what is space traffic management? Can you give us like a very basic primer for what it is?
Sure. So space traffic management is a lot of things to a lot of people. And that's a bit where the difficulty comes, that we don't have a common, clear one piece. But what space traffic management is right now, and where people collectively recognize it, is the ability to detect, project, and prevent collisions in space, as well as the policy framework that reduces the risk in space. Is that a policy framework about how soon you deorbit satellites, removal of debris? What is the requirements for new satellites going into space so that they don't create a future debris risk? How do we take this orbital domain and ensure that it is sustainable as the demand for use increases? So we can have a safe and sustainable orbital domain if we just stop all activity, right? Don't put any more satellites in space. Our safety level will stay exactly where it is today, provided no two objects collide and create a new debris field. ACEs, except that doesn't move the world forward. And the benefits on Earth of the space domain are tremendous. And to deny those benefits to Earth because we didn't look forward enough in how to create a sustainable environment would be irresponsible. So space traffic management seeks to bring all those things together. And it is by nature an international activity because space is an international domain. And so different people have different views. Some people say, well, it's just about preventing collisions. Well, yes and no, because there's preventing collisions, meaning two things are heading at each other and one of them has to move. But there's also preventing collisions in saying we can't continue to pollute the space environment. So we need to have proper standards moving forward to reduce that risk of pollution. And in many ways, the orbital domain is a problem like climate change. It is the choice to having polluted without thinking about it in terms of pollution, and now a global problem that has to be addressed, and that it cannot be successfully addressed by one or two parties. It needs to be sort of a universal process moving forward.
Interesting. So one public policy action that governments could take is to sort of de-incentivize this, like launching satellites into space and stop cluttering that environment. And earlier this year, you wrote an op-ed about the possibility of using an orbital use tax. Could you first explain what this orbital use tax is, and then elaborate as to why you don't see it as an absolution to the space debris crisis?
Sure. I was responding to an article, a study actually, that was advocating an orbital use. And what they advocated was that we should tax future users for the privilege to operate in orbit and set that tax at a high enough price to reduce demand. And what they put forward in the argument, and I believe this was University of Colorado at Boulder, what they put forward in the argument is if it is expensive enough, then people will be more responsible. But it depends on how you define responsible. And this is where I put my arguments forward, that what you're doing is taxing future users for the behavior of previous users. And from a public policy standpoint, that's not good policy. It's the same argument that we see from the developing world in climate change, where the developing world says, you, the industrialized world, already polluted, and now you're going to deny us access to the benefits of industrialization because of the pollution you created, that it's fundamentally unequal. So you have that question in terms of the global economy, that it's fundamentally unequal. But also, if we look further at where the big risks are to the orbital environment, and those big risks are large objects colliding, defunct objects in particular, because a maneuverable object doesn't introduce the same risk as a non-maneuverable object, because ostensibly a maneuverable object can get out of the way to avoid a collision if we have information about the collision risk. We had two defunct satellites in January that nearly collided. Actually, we had another two a couple weeks ago that nearly collided. And the hearing on space situational awareness rather talked about it. It's like, well, space situational awareness will let us know it's happening, but it doesn't allow us to prevent it from happening. We can simply watch. And that's not a good position to be in. So I believe it was 19 scientists from 11 countries came together at IAC and presented their list of the 50 highest risk objects in orbit. The risk was based on mass and position. How large are they? And are they in a popular orbit so that they're constantly creating the same hazard for the same satellites, because different orbits have different demands. And when they put all of their independent lists together, there was a lot of similarity. So the top 25 objects are spent rocket bodies from early in the space age that are very large, that still have propulsion on board. Is there technology to remove those things? And there is. There's technology emerging. But having the technology to remove those objects isn't enough, because who will pay for it, who's allowed to remove it, and how can it be removed safely are big questions, and those are policy questions. So I think I got a little bit far from your original question, I'm afraid, on this orbital use tax. So to put in a tax that says, let's make it more expensive for one more maneuverable object to go into space, doesn't address a problem of 50 rocket bodies that are posing a hazard today. So it's a mismatch. You're saying we're just going to restrict future use to compensate for behaviors in the past, when in fact, two things would be very important to reduce that orbital risk. One is to reach a global agreement on the prevention of kinetic anti-satellite testing, where we're not intentionally exploding things that remain in orbit, or to establish standards of how quickly any debris from an anti-satellite missile test deorbits, so that there's not like a surprise new cloud, because we all know in the space industry about key events that caused a large percentage of the debris population, and they were anti-satellite tests. So if we stop doing that, which we've slowed dramatically, right? We don't do very many, but we have no rule that says don't do it. We have no international agreement that says no country is going to explode a satellite. So if we had standards for that, that improves it. Also, standards that require you to remove all of the elements that are associated with a launch. And this is where we do have big advances in reusability make a difference in that. Because if you're not leaving your fairings and you spent rocket bodies in orbit, if you're bringing them back to Earth so they can be reused, you've already sort of erased that problem. There should be a benefit to that, right? Those operators that say we don't pollute in this launch should derive a benefit or a penalty for not using those technologies. And the other thing is removing your old objects. And this is where we have like that climate problem. What do we say to the countries? And almost all of the man-made debris in orbit today can be tracked to three countries, the US, Russia, and China. What is the obligation of these three dominant spacefaring nations to clean up the mess they have made so that that area is truly available to all? And that is a very complicated problem because that is diplomacy. That's not a matter of policy, rules, or technology. That is diplomacy. And how do we pay for it? Well, if the question is this orbital use tax could pay for it, you're asking the wrong people to pay. So say there's an innovative operation out of New Zealand, you want them to pay for the um, risk that's caused by the US, Russia, and China. That there's no moral basis for that. And that's the problem that I have with an orbital use tax, is that you are asking future users to pay for the harm caused by prior users.
That sounds very much like the argument for climate change on developing countries and emerging economies, and countries that like the U.S. and the European or countries in the European Union who like feel like they are the ones who are not polluting as much because technically right now China is polluting the most, but now they feel like, okay, what's China's fault right now. It's their problem, but really it's not, because you're the one, the US and industrialized countries are the ones who caused so much of it in the first place and like develop their economies without sort of any regulations for that. Interesting. So can you provide maybe some specific examples to what economic levers could address the root cause of the problem?
So when we think about space, we have to remember that space is different than other industries because there is a national interest in space leadership. China has a national interest in space leadership. The US has an interest, the Europeans have an interest in being a leading force in the development of technology and the use of space. So if there's a government interest, as opposed to say, I want to be a car manufacturer and everybody knows how to make cars, the country doesn't really need to invest in me as a car manufacturer because there's not a national interest in it. In space, the technology developed for the space industry benefits that country. That's why we have NASA as a research and development organization. That's why we do deep space exploration. Not because there's a commercial benefit to deep space exploration, but there's a national benefit to deep space exploration. So if we think about things like active debris removal and the development of those technologies as a benefit to the sponsoring nation, in the same way we think about the development of a lunar base as the benefit of the sponsoring nation, then we start to look at different economic models. So is there a reason for national investment in removing the objects we placed in space, in removing defunct satellites, and removing those rocket bodies? And if we can create a space cleanup race in the same way we created the space race in the 1960s and the 50s and 60s, then we can start to see new economic levers that we don't think of traditionally in commercial industries. And the space cleanup race, what can we agree to diplomatically that provides a benefit to those countries, right? That we look at the Outer Space Treaty and the issues of need for continuing supervision. Does it allow your nation to have more access to space if you are playing a key role in increasing the capacity of space? What is the exchange for the cleanup? What do you get for improving the situation? So if we take the climate change example again, right? There's a benefit to the world if Brazil does not burn down its rainforest. So the world is willing to look at Brazil and say, what can we do to prevent you from burning down the rainforest? Because you get an agricultural benefit if you turn it into arable land. But as a world, we don't want you to do that. So what economics can we bring into play to preserve that carbon sink for the world? Can we do the same thing with economics that we bring into play for the space domain? Recognizing that the access to space and the space, not just the space economy, but the benefits of space services benefit the world as a whole. So these are new ideas that we bring to the space community that come outside the traditional commercial levers. So it is, where can governments invest, where can we collectively invest, and where can we bring pressure to bear on each other to address these concerns?
Interesting. So you mentioned the idea of creating this sort of space cleanup race. And right now with all the excitement gathered around new space and these new launch vehicle companies, are you considering solutions that would involve having like commercial entities and private companies be incentivized towards cleaning up space debris, or do you envision something else?
No, why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we encourage innovation in on-orbit servicing and active debris removal? These are innovative and exciting technologies that will deliver benefits. So if the government sponsors the activity, then the government can derive benefit from the um, add-on technologies, right? We get a lot of things from space that we keep forgetting about, right? If it weren't for the moon race, we wouldn't have Mylar and Velcro and like the so many things that come from having that industry and that push. So what other technologies can we develop? What other information? How can we, for example, how would autonomous satellites to do on-orbit servicing or active debris removal deliver benefits for autonomous cars or AI development? There's so many things that come when a government can sponsor a innovative high-tech industry. And for space, a lot of the benefits have come because the government was able to de-risk the space exploration early by providing the funding for the whole space program, but even later. When we talk about new space, it seems very recent, but we've been doing commercial space launches since 1984. I was in high school in 1984. I retired from an entire career and started a second one. So we don't think of it in that way, but that was the government funding these launches that commercial providers developed the technology, developed the tools, and did the launch. So if we can do the same and look at it in those same terms, right? Why have a space race? Yeah, a lot of it was military, sure. But once the technology started to deliver, once things like Landsat and Copernicus, where they said, look, the government's putting up the satellite system, but we'll provide the data to everybody and create an industry that builds off of it. That is tremendous value to civilization as a whole. So let's not pretend that because space has become like commercial and it's not as like unusual as it used to be, that those levers don't matter, because they do, and they matter in a very important way.
Do you envision something like NASA contracts with U.S. companies to sort of further innovation in and technology into the space debris cleanup, or what other possibilities would there be in regards to this sort of funding and creating these incentives for companies to do this?
So why wouldn't they, right? NASA encourages innovation in so many areas, developing food systems on the moon, the private space station, the technology transfer program in NASA is phenomenal. So why would we ignore the biggest risk to space access in that innovation? There's no reason not to. The ability for us to continue to grow the space economy is dependent on us being able to address this risk from space debris. And the biggest way to address the risk is to reduce the amount of uncontrollable debris. Looking forward, we can require that your satellite be maneuverable, that it can carry this much propulsion, but not just on active debris removal, but think of on-orbit servicing. If you can refuel your satellite, then you don't have to carry as much fuel in your initial launch. You don't need to plan for 30 years from now if in 25 years you can service it on orbit. That's a bright future, and a future that it brings us benefits today because we can reduce the cost of launch, we can reduce what we put in the payload, and that's good for the environment as well, I might add, because you're reducing the amount of fuel it takes to get off the Earth. So why wouldn't we address our biggest concern with the same innovation that we use for sustaining life on the moon?
Exactly. Yeah. Why wouldn't we? Uh, so taking a step back, as far as what this looks like on an international scale, something about space that I think is really interesting is that international cooperation is extremely, extremely important. So in your February 2020 statement to the Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics of the House of Reps Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, you stated that regulation in the orbital domain has clear parallels to the maritime domain. Can you flesh out these parallels a bit, specifically in regards to how international cooperation has fostered this sort of maritime like a collision avoidance?
Yeah, I sure can. So everybody, not everybody, but people try to make parallels to aviation. And the interesting difference with aviation is that airspace is controlled by a single entity, each volume. It's segmented out, but only one authority has responsibility for the separation of aircraft in a given volume of airspace. In the maritime domain, that's not the true. So in aviation, even international airspace, it's delegated through a diplomatic process. So for example, the western side of the North Atlantic is controlled by the United States, not because the United States has any legal authority or claim to that airspace, but because the ICAO Council agreed that the US would take that responsibility. And that's done around the entire world for all of the international airspace, but still just one authority is responsible. We don't have that in space. We also don't have that on the high seas, right? Every country is responsible for enforcing the rules of the road over vessels that fly under their flag. So if your ship flies the flag of Mauritius, Mauritius is responsible for you following the international rules of the sea. So there's an international agreement on the rules, and where the complexity comes in is how that enforcement mechanism is applied in high seas, in international water. And that ties back to the treaty, and that the responsibility for enforcement falls to the state of registry. The same with space. The space treaty puts an obligation on the state of continuing supervision to the state of launch. So every object in space is registered to a specific country. We have a registry, and that country is responsible for the continuing supervision. So if we can agree on the international rules, we don't have to worry about who's responsible for space, because each country is responsible for the object they allowed to launch. So the enforcement mechanism is very similar to the maritime mechanism. The flag you fly under, the flag of registry, is responsible to ensure that the international rules are followed. And when you can address the enforcement portion, then you get through a lot of the resistance, because a rule that can't be enforced isn't really a rule. I would argue that you should still make rules even if the enforcement isn't clear, because rules are to maintain the safety of the environment. They're not, it's not a matter of criminal behavior. It's a matter of unsafe behavior. And when it comes to safety, rules are accepted in a different way, even without an enforcement authority, because they are for your safety and mine. The example I use on that is an intersection. We put a traffic light at an intersection, not so that the police can write tickets, but so that people know whether or not it's safe to proceed through that intersection. So we should still move forward, but the maritime law gives us a very clear model for the enforcement side of that equation. So we don't need to be hampered by the fact that there's no sovereignty in space, because we have a terrestrial model that we can follow. There's no sovereignty over the high seas either, but we are still able to maintain safety standards and regulate behavior.
Interesting. So, so where is the international sort of space policy community currently at in this in regards to space debris and creating these rules and regulation?
So I believe there's an emerging consensus in the space industry and in the space governance community that it's necessary. The problem is there's not consensus on what mechanisms are appropriate to do it. And this is where we fall back onto the Outer Space Treaty, and that the treaties that regulate outer space were negotiated in a period when there was no such thing as commercial space. And this is where we break away from the world of both maritime and aviation, because the international treaties for those two domains were done with an existing commercial user. So the treaties themselves are structured where commercial activity exists. Since the space treaties were, I think the last one was agreed to in 1972, the only space actors were governments. They're very loose. And whenever there's a treaty about governments where there could be a line where it's seen that one is regulating another or one is giving up sovereignty to the international community, it becomes very difficult. So the language gets very watered down. And so we have treaties that not only are a mismatch because they didn't recognize a commercial activity, but are also written in a very soft way that makes it difficult to develop and enforce standards. So what they've done in the space community through the international mechanisms from the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs is these protracted discussions that resulted in the 21 guidelines for the long-term sustainability of space. So that was good. That was a major milestone. It took a long time. That's problematic. And also it has two elements that I believe um, put us in a paradigm that's difficult. And those two elements are that the guidelines are voluntary and consensus. Well, if you think logically through that, if they're voluntary, why do you need consensus? Why can't you come up with voluntary standards that are truly best practices? Because consensus agreements by nature tend to be weakened significantly in order to achieve that consensus. If they are consensus based, where we've been able to reach global agreement, why would they be voluntary? Because you have overcome the hurdle by making them consensus. So to have something that is both consensus and voluntary makes it very, very weak and doesn't allow you to get to like these hard questions. Like, for example, how long after a satellite is defunct should it be allowed to remain in orbit? What is the deorbit requirement to clean up the environment? And right now we have the 25-year rule, which is not actually a rule. It's a standard. It only applies to NASA. It's not globally accepted. It's sort of like looked at and like maybe that'd be a good idea. 25 years is an extraordinarily long time to leave a defunct satellite in space. And why do we have that standard? Well, again, it's old. It was agreed to when the state of the technology said, well, in 25 years, we can probably get it out of there. Well, we can deorbit a satellite much more quickly now. And so rules that take advantage of the state of technology are important, but also we don't have a global agreement on that. So say we wanted global agreement on a rule that said you need to deorbit a defunct satellite within 2 years. How do you get that agreement? That's a very difficult bar. And if you say, okay, we're going to agree on a rule and it's going to be consensus and voluntary, what are you going to end up with? Right? Probably something that's too long because it's not going to be state of the art because of the consensus. And then there's no requirement to comply with it. So where we are as a global space community is a bit tied or held back by our history. So we're anchored to the history of the Outer Space Treaty, which is not fit for purpose. It's a good treaty, don't get me wrong. It just wasn't written for the environment that we have and the industry that we have, and also to a paradigm of consensus and voluntary that lacks the rigor for us to really move forward. And this is where we can get models from aviation. And the standards that are developed in ICAO, and ICAO has an extraordinarily strong treaty, and we'll probably never see a treaty as strong as that one again, largely due to its history and when it was developed. But the ICAO process seeks a standard that can be implemented in every country of the world. It is not consensus. They strive for consensus, but they reach a point where consensus is not required. If we have a standard that is supported by a significant majority and can be implemented around the world, that standard will move forward. And the mitigation for that is that countries, and they have this authority under their treaty, can differ from that standard, but they must do it publicly. They have to provide transparency because the standards are for safety. And so the transparency is the safety mitigation for not applying the standard so that everybody knows what you will be doing. We're not going to do this, but we're going to do that. And that gets you a very effective path forward for safety standards without the encumbrances of a voluntary consensus standard. And I know that was a lot of blah, 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 but that's why policy is so fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I remember I watched a video a couple of days ago where you're talking about how you surprised me because you said that consensus isn't necessarily necessary. It's just that transparency is more important. And if you have like most countries in the world who agree on this sort of standard, then as long as other countries still have the sovereignty to like go against those rules, then all you need is for them to explain for that. And short story short, like or long story short, what does a timeline look like to get from today to that point where we have this sort of international, somewhat of consensus, probably not like ideal consensus, but transparency.
So that's a challenge, determining a timeline. And unfortunately, when it comes to safety standards, that timeline is usually accelerated by catastrophe. And we don't want that to be our motivator. We've had 2 close calls in 1 year. That's pretty significant. We should give a great deal of weight to those close calls, because it's not just the loss of those 2 objects, it's the debris field that they create. And that creates a problem for everyone else. In aviation, most of the standards came from loss of life. We don't want that to be the case for the space community. So we need some lessons learned. But if the US, Europe, and China agreed on best practices, the rest of the spacefaring world would either follow those practices, or they'd be very public about their arguments. And then we would have that transparency part. So we can work within the global framework that brings all the parties together in the Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And think about that name as well, Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Well, yes, we're talking about peaceful use, but the motivator is not that anymore, right? We need safe and sustainable orbital domain. So the motivation when we came together as a space community is that the US and Russia were going to blow up the world. Quite honestly, that was the fear. That was the motivator for the treaties. That was the motivator for the Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. The US and Russia are going to blow up the world. That's not our paradigm anymore. We're not worried about 2 superpowers waging war in space. We are concerned about military use and proliferation, and those are other levels of diplomacy that's sort of outside the space community, because that is the national security areas. And when we talk about the space community as a commercial entity, we have an interest, but those are layers that have different motivators and different actors. In the civil space world, there is still this interest in how do we preserve the space domain, and that's a safety orientation, not a security orientation. So if the major players reach agreement in bilateral, trilateral ways, you drive the discussion forward in the global international community. There are people that resist that approach because it sounds very mean, and that the big actors are controlling everything and they might just serve their own interests. And that's true, except for that the common interest is to make sure that the space environment is safe to operate in. So there are benefits to the other users. If you get the big players to the table, you can start to solve the problems in a more aggressive way than if you always have to wait for once every 2 years we meet, and this is when everybody comes together, and maybe the right people are at the table and maybe they're not. It's a reality that we don't always say out loud.
This reminds me of, what is it? Speak softly, carry a big stick. Interesting, great. So let's see, last question for this interview. Let's take a step back from this entire very specific part of space policy and international transparency and cooperation. So looking at the current environment of space, something big that was just announced was that Jim Bridenstine, the current NASA administrator, announced last week that he will be stepping down under Joe Biden's administration next year. I remember, like, in the beginning that there was a fair amount of controversy when he was nominated and confirmed into the position, but since his start, the space community has taken a very generally positive view of his leadership, especially with moving the Artemis program forward. So what do you think his legacy will be moving into the future? And after that, what do you expect to see in the next administration in regard to space policy and NASA?
So that's an important question, right? So NASA is jewel, right? It's the jewel of the American space policy, and it's recognized around the world, and our leadership in that is important. And Jim Bridenstine's done an excellent job. I would argue that every NASA administrator has done an excellent job. So we're fortunate in the NASA side of space that we have people who lead that agency that have a great love of space, had great enthusiasm for it and tremendous support. And I think Jim has enjoyed all of those. His legacy, I believe, will be the Artemis Accords. I think he has earned that legacy, and I think that will carry with him, and we'll see a lot of him in the space community after he leaves NASA. For space policy in the U.S., there's a lot of things that make up space policy, and one thing is that despite the changes from the Trump administration, they didn't change our national space policy. There were tweaks, but the national space policy stays intact. There were space policy directives that were added on. There was sort of different pushes, but in that big picture, that tends to carry from administration to administration to administration. Where we see big changes are in programs. They're programmatic changes rather than policy changes. What about the lifespan of the International Space Station? Our timeline for the lunar base, the mission to Mars? Those are all within the programs, but our space policy is much bigger than that. Those are the high profile things that people see. So what do I think that will change in a Biden administration is we may see changes to some timelines, but I don't think that there'll be major directional changes about where we're going for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that space enjoys broad bipartisan support. And there's a lot of interest in the direction of our nation. And it ebbs and flows almost always on the money side. So I think that actually the thing that puts our sort of outlook for space from a government policy perspective in the most jeopardy is the resources that have been redirected to COVID, the financial strain on the nation itself. And this happened with Apollo as well. A lot of money was going into NASA for the Apollo program, and we had a war in Vietnam, and we had strains on the budget, and the question was, is this worth the money? We'll see those debates having nothing to do with whether people like what NASA's doing or not, but rather the tremendous budgetary strain that has been placed on the nation by COVID. And that's not going to slow down anytime soon, because distribution of vaccines and the time it takes to rebuild the economy and the debt that we took on board in the last year, I think for a lot of government programs, not NASA or space policy in particular, but everything is going to suffer from this pressure.
Let's see. Well, on that note, I think that this was incredibly informational and very interesting interview. Thank you for being, thank you so much for being the first space expert to talk with us for the Strauss Center Space Security and Safety Program.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Bye.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you.